is conversation with God. We lift our hearts and minds to the divine reality. Just like any important conversation in our life, we should prepare. If you are going to see your accountant, collect your financial information and take it with you. If you're going to speak to God, collect your thoughts and present them to God. No, this isn't God. This is Father Robert Rankin, the pastor of St. Melanie Byzantine Catholic Church. He will introduce you to a Catholic understanding of prayer.
When we speak of prayer, one of the obstacles immediately that a lot of people have in prayer is understanding that it falls in the context of a relationship. Our relationship in prayer obviously has to do with God, and that means that faith is a necessary virtue in order to have a prayer life. Now that might seem obvious, but a lot of times we skip over the obvious. A wonderful illustration to help us understand this truth is a great story that's been told in many different ways in many different contexts. It's a story of a group of people who are walking down a country road, and coming at them is another person. However, this person that's approaching them is radiant. They're just shining. And naturally, this group of people, as they observe this heavenly, shining individual approaching them, is taken back. And as they get closer to the person, able to speak to them, they say, well, are you an angel from heaven? And the person says, no. And they say, well, are you a holy prophet? And he says, no. And he says, well, are you an apparition? And he says, no. And they say, well, who are you? And he says, I'm awake. Now, you either got that or you didn't. But the inference is the person was glowing with the light of God because they were awake to the presence of God. So prayer is not an escape from reality. It's not an escape from this world. It is a lifting of awareness, of consciousness, of the reality of God. So the old definition of prayer, lifting our minds and hearts to God, is a good one, but it's not necessarily the definition of prayer that I enjoy the most. The definition I like the most is being aware of the one who is always aware of us. Being conscious of the one who is always conscious of us. Being awake to the one who is always awake to us. So prayer is the process of conversion of heart, of waking up. And so when we do become more aware of God, then that's when we're going to begin to understand prayer ever better.
Prayer is lifting our hearts and mind to God. Prayer is being aware of the one who is always aware of us. Prayer changes us and how we see the world. Padre Pio, now Saint Pio, was a deeply prayerful and holy man. People saw him as a true friend of God. Truly, he was awake to reality. Consider now the example of Saint Teresa Benedicta, or Saint Edith Stein as she is also known. She was a Jew that converted to Catholicism and was executed in Auschwitz. Listen to her story of the effect of prayer in her life.
A wonderful story, I think, from our recent 20th century that helps to explain the relationship between faith and between prayer is the life of Edith Stein. Edith Stein was a philosopher in the 20th century. She was very much a world-renowned speaker. She was very much in demand around the world as a philosophy teacher. She was also a devout atheist, if we can combine those two words. In the 1920s, she converted to Catholicism, much to the shock of the intellectual community. They had known her as a great speaker, as a great teacher of philosophy, and they had known her, of course, as an atheist, much like many of them. Now, let's just talk about her journey of conversion for a moment. A lot of it was intellectual, because to be a teacher of philosophy, you had to study the great philosophers of the Greek and Roman world, Plato and Aristotle, and even the modern philosophers like Feuerbach and Nietzsche, who spoke of a philosophy of atheism. But remember, philosophy is the love of wisdom, a desire for the truth. And she also, that meant, had to understand and study the great Christian teachers who wedded philosophy, a search for wisdom and truth, to the search for God. St. Augustine, who married Platonic philosophy with the philosophy of the faith. St. Thomas Aquinas, who married Aristotelian philosophy to the theology of the faith. So as she studied these great men and found that they found no contradiction with reason and religion, with faith and a search for wisdom and truth, even in the social sciences, she began to realize that there was another path. There was a path that put the two of these things together. So she was edging intellectually towards faith. But she tells the story of her conversion. Her conversion happened, the trigger for that was she came into a church one time in the middle of winter to seek a little respite from the cold and to have a little quiet time. Churches are good for that, even for those who don't believe. And as she sat in the back of the church, an old peasant woman came in. She walked down the aisle of the church and she knelt down and prayed. And it was then that Edith Stein's whole being was able to step across that threshold of faith. Why was that the case? I mean, it is a beautiful image to see a humble person come and kneel and pray. But for Edith, she recognized that this was an act of intellectual humility, that the peasant woman represented humanity bowing its mind and heart to the reality of God. And she recognized that that's what she had been missing, that the journey to God was not just going to be an intellectual one. It was going to be one in which she had to make a surrender of her whole being to the reality of God.
Prayer is an encounter with the reality of God. The most important rule about prayer is that you have to show up. God is going to be there anyway. Edith Stein overcame her reluctance to encounter reality when she saw an example of prayer. Her choice, as a Jew and a philosopher, to accept baptism was controversial in her family and intellectual community. It led her to join Carmel, an ancient religious order dedicated to the contemplative life. She was there during World War II when she was arrested by the German authorities, along with her sister and other Jews, in retaliation against the Dutch bishops that had denounced the German conduct of the war. She was sent to Auschwitz, where she and many others on her train were immediately executed. Not all the realities of our life are pleasant. Christ was crucified. God is present in all things, even death. The experience of prayer is to awaken to reality and not to succumb to passing pleasures and the fear of brutality. To respond to God's grace, His call, you must have faith that He is there when you respond in prayer. Please take time to pray. God is waiting.